I never thought a snowplow would become the most controversial topic in my Minnesota neighborhood. But here we are, standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning while a woman named Brenda screams about community standards. My name is Brian Erickson, and I have lived in the Pinewood Estates subdivision in Bloomington, Minnesota for the past 6 years. It is a decent neighborhood, nothing fancy. Just regular middle-class homes with decent yards and a homeowners association that mostly stayed out of my business until this winter. The HOA had always been relatively quiet, sending out the occasional newsletter about lawn care or reminding people to take down Christmas decorations by mid-January. I paid my dues on time, kept my grass cut, and generally followed the rules without much thought. Then we got hit with the worst winter Minnesota had seen in a decade. We are talking about multiple feet of snow, weekly storms that dumped 8 to 12 inches at a time, and temperatures that stayed below zero for weeks. My driveway is long, probably about 100 feet from the street to my garage, and there was no way I was going to shovel that mess by hand every few days. I tried it once after the first big storm and threw out my back so badly I could barely walk for 3 days. That is when I found Tommy. Tommy Reeves ran a small snow removal business, just him and his truck with a plow attachment. He was not part of some big company, just a guy trying to make extra money during the winter months. I found him through a recommendation from my coworker, and he was perfect for what I needed. He charged me $80 per visit, and he would come out within a few hours of any significant snowfall. The guy was reliable, fast, and did excellent work. He would plow my driveway, clean up around my mailbox, and even do a quick pass on my front walkway. For $80, it was a steal. The arrangement worked perfectly for the first 2 months of winter. Tommy would show up, do his job, and I would transfer him payment through my banking app. Easy, simple, no complaints. My driveway was always clear. I never had to worry about getting stuck trying to leave for work, and my back remained intact. Then came that Tuesday morning in early January when Brenda Morrison knocked on my door at 6:45 in the morning. I was still in my pajamas, barely halfway through my first cup of coffee, when I heard the aggressive pounding. When I opened the door, Brenda stood there in a puffy purple coat, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and her face already twisted into an expression of righteous indignation. "Brian Erickson," she said, not even bothering with a good morning. "We need to talk about your snow removal service." I blinked at her, still trying to wake up. "My what? Your plow guy, the one who comes in that blue pickup truck. The HOA has been receiving complaints." "Complaints about what? He plows my driveway. That's it." Brenda crossed her arms. "He is creating an unfair visual disparity in the neighborhood. Some driveways are clear, others are not. It makes our community look disorganized and poorly maintained." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what she had just said. "You are complaining that my driveway is too clean." "I am saying that we need uniformity. The HOA board has decided that we need to implement a community-wide snow removal solution, and we need the contact information for your service provider." "Why do you need my guy's information? You can find your own plow service." "We have already reached out to several companies, and they are either completely booked for the season or charging outrageous rates. Your provider clearly has availability, so we want to negotiate a neighborhood contract with him." I rubbed my face, trying to wake up enough to deal with this conversation. "Brenda, Tommy is a one-man operation. He barely has time to handle his current clients. I do not think he can take on the entire neighborhood. Let us worry about that. Just give us his contact information, and the board will handle the negotiations." Something about her tone set me off. Maybe it was the early hour. Maybe it was the demanding way she spoke. Or maybe it was just the accumulated frustration of dealing with the HOA's increasingly petty rules over the years. Whatever it was, I felt a spark of malicious compliance light up in my brain. "Sure," I said slowly. "I will give you his information, but I should let Tommy know to expect your call first, professional courtesy and all that." Brenda's expression shifted slightly, suspicion creeping into her eyes. "That is fine. Just make sure we get his number by this afternoon. The board is meeting tomorrow night, and we want to have this resolved quickly." "Oh, I will make sure Tommy knows all about it," I said with a smile that probably looked a bit too pleasant. After she left, I stood in my kitchen, coffee in hand, and thought about the situation. The HOA wanted Tommy's information, and I would give it to them. But I was also going to make sure Tommy understood exactly what he was dealing with and give him some advice on how to handle it. I called Tommy around 9 that morning. He answered on the third ring, sounding like he was already out working. "Hey Brian, what's up? Did you need an extra pass? I know we got a few inches last night." "No, the driveway looks great, but I need to talk to you about something. The HOA in my neighborhood is going to be calling you." There was a pause. "Okay, what about?" "They want to hire you to plow the entire neighborhood. Apparently they think it is unfair that some driveways are clear and others are not." Tommy laughed. "The whole neighborhood?" "Brian, I have got maybe 30 clients right now, and that is pushing my limit. Your subdivision has what, 80 houses? 92, actually." "Yeah, that is not happening. I would need to hire people, get more equipment. That is a whole different business model. Here is the thing, Tommy. The HOA is going to push. They are demanding your information, and they are going to try to negotiate some kind of deal. But I have an idea if you are interested. I am listening. They are desperate. Every big company is booked and they are stuck. So when they call you, do not tell them you cannot do it. Instead, give them a price." "What kind of price?" I grinned even though he could not see me. "Triple what you charge me, $240 per house per visit." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "That is insane. Nobody would pay that. That is the point. Either they say no and leave you alone, or they say yes and you make enough money to make it worth the hassle. Win-win for you. And if they actually agree to that price, then you hire some help, rent another plow truck, and make a killing this winter. Worst case scenario, you make a lot of money. Best case scenario, they get mad and find someone else, and you keep doing what you are doing." I could hear the smile in Tommy's voice. "You are a devious man, Brian Erickson. I am a man who is tired of the HOA sticking their nose in my business. So, are you in?" "Oh, I am definitely in. This is going to be fun." I gave Tommy Brenda's number and told him to expect a call within the next day or two. Then I sent Brenda a text message with Tommy's contact information, along with a note that said I had already spoken with him, and he was expecting their call. The next evening, I got a text from Brenda that simply said, "Board meeting tomorrow at 7 p.m. Your attendance is requested." It was not really a request, despite the wording. When the HOA requested your attendance, they meant it was mandatory unless you had a very good excuse. I showed up at the community center at 7, grabbed a folding chair in the back row, and waited for the show to begin. The board consisted of 5 people. Brenda Morrison as president, Gerald Hoffman as vice president, Susan Chen as treasurer, Mark Williams as secretary, and Patricia Davis as the member at large. They sat at a folding table at the front of the room, looking very official with their printed agendas and matching binders. About 20 other homeowners were scattered throughout the room, most of them looking like they would rather be anywhere else. HOA meetings were typically boring affairs full of discussions about paint colors, fence heights, and other minutiae that made you question why you ever bought a house in a planned community. Brenda called the meeting to order and went through the usual routine of approving the previous meeting's minutes and giving financial updates. Then she got to what she called new business. As many of you know, we have been dealing with a significant issue regarding snow removal this winter. The heavy snowfall has created challenges for many homeowners, and the board has been working diligently to find a solution that benefits the entire community. I leaned back in my chair, interested to see where this was going. We have identified a local snow removal provider who currently serves one of our residents. Brenda continued, glancing in my direction. The board reached out to this provider to negotiate a community-wide contract that would ensure all driveways in Pinewood Estates are properly maintained throughout the winter season. Gerald Hoffman jumped in. We received a quote from the provider, and while the price is higher than we initially hoped, we believe it is a worthwhile investment in our community's appearance and safety. I sat up straighter. Wait, they were actually considering Tommy's inflated price. Susan Chen shuffled some papers. The provider has quoted $240 per household per snow removal visit. Based on typical snowfall patterns, we estimate approximately 2 visits per month for the remainder of winter, which would be $480 per household through March. A woman in the front row raised her hand. That seems extremely expensive. I have been shoveling my own driveway just fine. The contract would be mandatory for all residents, Brenda said firmly. This falls under our community standards clause. When a majority of homes do not have proper snow removal, it negatively impacts our property values and present safety concerns. A man near the middle of the room stood up. You cannot force us to pay for a service we do not want. That is not what HOA dues are for. Mark Williams flipped through his binder. Actually, according to our bylaws, Section 7, Paragraph 3, the board has the authority to implement mandatory community improvement services when deemed necessary for the safety and appearance of the neighborhood. The cost would be added to each homeowner's quarterly dues as a special assessment. I could not believe what I was hearing. They were actually going to force everyone to pay Tommy's ridiculous rates. The room erupted in arguments, people shouting over each other about the cost, the legality, and whether anyone had actually read the bylaws before signing them. I raised my hand and waited for the chaos to die down. Brenda noticed and called on me with a tight smile. Yes, Brian. I assume you have some insight since this is your service provider. I stood up slowly. Just to be clear, you are planning to charge every household in this neighborhood $240 every time it snows enough to require plowing. That is correct. The provider was very clear that this is his rate for a project of this scale. And everyone has to participate. There is no opt-out, correct? This is for the benefit of the entire community. I nodded slowly, sitting back down. I did not say anything else, but inside I was calculating. 92 houses times $240 per visit times roughly 4 visits for the rest of winter. That was over $88,000. Tommy was going to make an absolute fortune, and the HOA was going to have a revolt on their hands. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, with various homeowners voicing their complaints and the board stubbornly insisting that this was within their rights. Finally, they called for a board vote. It passed 4-1, with only Patricia Davis voting against it. She had been quiet most of the meeting, but she spoke up before the vote. I think this is a mistake. We are talking about forcing people to pay for a service that many of them do not need or want. This is going to cause serious problems. But she was outvoted, and the motion passed. Brenda announced that the contract would begin immediately, with the first mandatory plow scheduled for the next significant snowfall. Homeowners would receive an updated dues statement within the week. I left the meeting and immediately called Tommy. "They actually did it," I told him as I walked to my car. "They approved your price, every house mandatory participation." Tommy was silent for a long moment. "You are kidding." "Nope. They voted it through tonight. You are about to become very popular and very hated at the same time." "Brian, I cannot actually do this by myself. I told you that." "Then hire some help. Rent equipment." "You quoted them that price and they accepted it. That is a binding agreement." "This is insane. That is nearly $22,000 every time I plow that neighborhood." "Yep." "Welcome to dealing with an HOA that does not understand the word no. You gave them a price hoping they would go away, and instead they called your bluff." Tommy laughed, but it sounded slightly panicked. "I guess I better start making some calls. I know a couple of guys who might be interested in some temporary work, and there is a rental place that has plow trucks available." "Good luck, man. You are going to need it." The next week was beautiful chaos. The updated dues statements went out, and my phone started ringing off the hook with neighbors wanting to know what was happening. Apparently, word had spread that this was all connected to my plow guy, and people wanted answers. I explained the situation to anyone who asked. Yes, Tommy was my plow service. Yes, he quoted them that price. No, I did not tell him to charge that much. Okay, that last part was a lie, but I was not about to admit to that publicly. A group of about 15 homeowners got together and hired a lawyer to look into whether the HOA could actually force this special assessment on everyone. The lawyer came back with bad news. The bylaws really did give the board that authority, as long as it was for community improvement and safety. It was a broad clause that had probably seemed reasonable when the neighborhood was first developed, but now it was being weaponized in a way nobody had anticipated. Some people just decided not to pay. They figured the HOA could not actually do anything about it. They were wrong. Brenda sent out letters threatening liens on properties for non-payment of dues and assessments. In Minnesota, HOAs have pretty broad powers to enforce payment, including placing liens that could eventually lead to foreclosure. It rarely got that far, but the threat was real enough to scare most people into compliance. Meanwhile, Tommy was scrambling to put together a crew. He hired 2 guys he knew from another landscaping business, both of whom had experience with snow removal. He rented a second plow truck from a local equipment company. He even created an actual business entity and got proper insurance for a larger operation. The guy was taking this seriously because he realized he was sitting on a potential gold mine. The next big snowfall came about 10 days after the board meeting. We got 8 inches overnight, and by 6 in the morning, Tommy and his crew were rolling into Pinewood Estates with 2 plow trucks. I watched from my window as they worked their way through the neighborhood. Tommy took one side of the main street while one of his crew members took the other. The third guy followed behind with a smaller pickup, doing cleanup work on mailboxes and walkways. They were actually pretty efficient, all things considered. My driveway got done along with everyone else's. The neighborhood did look impressively uniform, with every driveway cleared to the same standard. I had to admit, it was kind of nice. But then the complaints started rolling in. People were furious about the cost, furious about being forced to pay for something they did not want. Furious that the HOA had that much power over their finances. The neighborhood Facebook page turned into an absolute war zone, with people posting angry rants, calling for the board to be recalled, and threatening legal action. Brenda, to her credit or perhaps stubbornness, doubled down. She posted a long message about community standards, property values, and the importance of presenting a unified appearance. She insisted that this was a small price to pay for a beautiful, well-maintained neighborhood. That did not go over well. Someone created a petition to recall the entire board. Within 3 days, it had signatures from over 60% of the homeowners. According to the bylaws, that was more than enough to trigger a special election. Things escalated when Gerald Hoffman, the vice president, suddenly resigned from the board. He posted a public statement saying he had supported the snow removal contract initially, but now realized it was a mistake. He apologized to the neighborhood and said he could not in good conscience continue to support the policy. That left the board at 4 members, and Patricia Davis, who had voted against the measure, started openly campaigning for the contract to be canceled. That meant the board was now effectively split, with 3 members supporting the contract and 1 opposing it, plus 1 vacancy. The special election was scheduled for mid-February. In the meantime, we got another major snowfall, which meant another round of mandatory plowing and another $240 charge per household. Tommy and his crew showed up and did their job efficiently, but I could see the tension in the neighborhood. People stood in their doorways watching with angry expressions. A couple of people actually confronted Tommy while he was working, yelling at him about his prices. Tommy called me after that second plow job, sounding stressed. "Brian, I do not know if this is worth it. People are treating me like I am robbing them at gunpoint. You gave them a price and they accepted it. You are just doing the job they contracted you for." "I know, but this is getting ugly. Someone left a nasty note on my truck today." Another person threatened to report me to the Better Business Bureau for price gouging. "Did you do anything illegal?" "No, I gave them a quote, they accepted it. It is all above board." "Then you are fine. Look, I know it is uncomfortable, but you are making good money here. Just finish out the contract through winter, and then you can decide if you want to deal with them again next year." Tommy sighed. "Yeah, I guess. It is just weird being the bad guy when I am literally just plowing snow." The special election happened on a cold Saturday morning in mid-February. The community center was packed with homeowners who actually showed up to vote, which was unprecedented. Usually, HOA elections drew maybe 20 people. This time, there were over 70. 4 candidates ran for board positions. 2 who wanted to cancel the snow removal contract, and 2 who supported keeping it. The pro-cancellation candidates won in a landslide. Brenda, Susan, and Mark were all voted out. New board members were installed immediately, and their first official act was to review the snow removal contract. Here is where things got interesting. The new board president, a retired lawyer named Robert Eastman, carefully read through the contract that Brenda had signed with Tommy. He called an emergency meeting 3 days after the election. "We have a problem," Robert announced to the packed community center. "The contract with the snow removal service is legally binding through the end of March. We cannot simply cancel it without cause. If we breach the contract, the provider can sue us for the full expected value of the remaining services." The room erupted in angry shouts. People wanted to know how Brenda had been allowed to sign such a contract. Why had nobody reviewed it more carefully? What were their options now? Robert held up his hands for quiet. "We have consulted with our attorney. We have a few options. First, we can simply fulfill the contract and pay the provider through March, then decline to renew. Second, we can attempt to negotiate an early termination with the provider. Third, we can try to argue that the contract was signed without proper authority, but that is risky and would likely involve litigation." "How much are we talking about if we just let the contract run out?" someone asked. "Based on typical snowfall, probably 2 to 3 more plow events." That is between $44,000 and $66,000 for the neighborhood. The groans and angry mutters filled the room. I sat quietly in the back, watching the fallout from what had started as a simple attempt to clear my own driveway. Robert continued, "I am going to reach out to the service provider and see if he is willing to negotiate an early termination. Maybe we can settle on a reasonable buyout amount." 2 days later, I got a call from Tommy. "Your new HOA president wants to meet with me. He is talking about canceling the contract." "What are you going to do?" "I am going to listen to what he has to say." "Honestly, Brian, I would not mind getting out of this contract. The money is good, but the hostility is not worth it. Every time I show up, people glare at me like I killed their dog." "Whatever you decide, make sure you get something out of it. You turned down other potential clients to commit to this contract. You rented equipment. You deserve compensation if they want out early." Tommy met with Robert and 2 other new board members the following week. They negotiated for over 2 hours. In the end, they agreed to a settlement. The HOA would pay Tommy $20,000 to terminate the contract immediately. It was less than he would have made if the contract ran through March, but it was guaranteed money with no additional work required, and it got him out of an increasingly hostile situation. The HOA sent out another special assessment to cover the $20,000 buyout, which worked out to about $218 per household. People were not happy about it, but it was better than paying for more plow services they did not want. Brenda Morrison kept a low profile after being voted out. I saw her occasionally around the neighborhood, but she never made eye contact. The whole experience seemed to have humbled her, at least temporarily. As for me, I went back to my original arrangement with Tommy. He continued plowing my driveway for $80 per visit, and I continued to be perfectly happy with the service. A few of my neighbors asked if they could hire Tommy individually, and he took on about 5 more clients in the neighborhood at his regular rates. But the story does not end there. In early March, just when things were finally calming down, I got a notice in the mail from the HOA. It was a fine for unauthorized private snow removal services creating visual non-uniformity in the neighborhood. I read the notice 3 times, unable to believe what I was seeing. The fine was $200, and it cited the same community standards clause that had started this whole mess. Apparently, now that the mandatory neighborhood contract was canceled, having a private plow service was somehow against the rules again. I called Robert Eastman immediately. "What is this fine about? You cannot be serious." Robert sounded tired. "Brian, I did not send that. I am looking into it now. Give me a day to figure out what happened." It turned out that Susan Chen, the former treasurer, had sent out the fine before she officially left the board. It was one last petty act of revenge, apparently directed at me specifically since this whole situation had started with my plow service. Robert voided the fine and sent me a formal apology on behalf of the HOA. He also sent a notice to Susan Chen informing her that if she attempted any further actions claiming to represent the HOA, they would pursue legal action against her for fraud. But Susan was not done yet. 2 weeks later, I came home to find my mailbox had been knocked over. It was not weather damage. Someone had clearly hit it with something heavy. The post was cracked, and the mailbox itself was dented and hanging at an odd angle. I checked my security camera footage and saw a car drive by slowly around 2 in the morning, pause near my mailbox, and then someone got out and hit it several times with what looked like a baseball bat before driving away. The video was dark and grainy, but the car looked like Susan's silver sedan. I called the police and filed a report. I also sent the video footage to the investigating officer. They went to Susan's house and questioned her. She denied everything, of course, but the officer told me later that they noticed a baseball bat in her garage that had fresh damage on it consistent with hitting a metal mailbox. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges. We have circumstantial evidence, and the video is not clear enough for a positive identification. But if you want to pursue it, we can build a case. It is criminal mischief and property damage. I thought about it for a while. Part of me wanted to see Susan face consequences for her petty vandalism, but another part of me just wanted this whole situation to be over. What happens if I press charges? I asked. We would charge her with criminal mischief, which is a misdemeanor. If convicted, she is looking at a fine and possibly probation. It is unlikely she would see any jail time for a first offense like this. In the end, I decided to press charges. The officer said Susan had not just damaged my property, she had tried to intimidate me, and that was not acceptable. The criminal justice process moved slowly. Susan was formally charged in April. She pleaded not guilty initially, and we went through months of pre-trial motions and discussions. Meanwhile, spring arrived in Minnesota, and the snow melted away. Tommy went back to his regular landscaping work. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though there was still underlying tension. The new board worked on revising the bylaws to prevent future boards from having such broad authority to implement mandatory services. Susan's case finally went to trial in late July. I had to testify about the mailbox damage and the video footage. The prosecutor brought in an expert who analyzed the video and testified that the car in the footage matched Susan's vehicle in several key identifying features. They also presented photos of the baseball bat found in her garage, which had metal transfer marks consistent with the material of my mailbox. Susan's lawyer argued that the video was too unclear for positive identification, and that plenty of people owned silver sedans and baseball bats. But the jury did not buy it. After 3 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty of criminal mischief. The judge sentenced her to 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay restitution for my mailbox plus court costs. He also gave her a stern lecture about how disputes between neighbors should never escalate to property damage, and how someone in her position of relative authority in the community should have known better. As Susan left the courtroom, she finally made eye contact with me for the first time since this all started. She looked tired and angry, but also defeated. I did not feel particularly triumphant. The whole situation had been ridiculous from start to finish, and I was just glad it was finally over. That summer, the HOA held another special meeting to vote on the revised bylaws. The changes included requiring a full neighborhood vote for any mandatory service that would cost over $50 per household, limiting the board's authority to impose special assessments, and creating a clearer process for homeowners to challenge board decisions. The new bylaws passed with overwhelming support. Brenda Morrison quietly moved out of the neighborhood in August. I heard through the rumor mill that she and her husband had decided they wanted a fresh start somewhere else. Her house sold quickly, and a young couple with 2 kids moved in. They seemed nice and normal, and they had no interest in HOA politics. Tommy and I stayed friends throughout all of this. We occasionally grabbed beers together, and he loved telling the story of the time he almost made $88,000 plowing one neighborhood. He eventually expanded his business and hired full-time help, but he stayed small and local, focusing on reliable service rather than big contracts. As for me, I learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of malicious compliance. My plan to have Tommy quote an outrageous price had backfired spectacularly. Instead of discouraging the HOA, it had emboldened them. It led to months of neighborhood drama, a recall election, a financial settlement, and ultimately criminal charges against someone who probably just needed to learn to let things go. The following winter, Minnesota got hit with even more snow than the previous year. Tommy plowed my driveway reliably and efficiently for his standard $80 rate. A few other neighbors hired him privately. Most people just shoveled themselves or used other services. The driveways were not uniform, and nobody cared. The neighborhood looked lived in and normal, with the natural variation that comes from people making their own choices about their own properties. I never got another knock on my door at 6:45 in the morning from someone demanding information about my service providers. The new HOA board focused on actual community needs like maintaining the common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and keeping the streetlights functional. They stayed out of people's personal business, and life was better for everyone. Sometimes I drive past my mailbox, which I replaced with a sturdier model mounted in concrete, and I think about how a simple thing like snow removal spiraled into such an absurd conflict. It started with a demanding HOA president who could not accept that some people might want different things than the rest of the neighborhood. It escalated because I decided to be clever instead of just saying no. And it ended with legal battles, recall elections, and criminal charges. The whole experience reinforced something I had always suspected. HOA, when run by reasonable people with limited authority, can be fine. They can handle the basics of maintaining common property and enforcing reasonable standards. But when you give a small group of people too much power and no accountability, things can go sideways fast. Add in someone like Brenda Morrison, who saw every minor difference as a personal affront to her vision of community perfection, and you have a recipe for disaster. I still live in Pinewood Estates. My property value did not collapse because my neighbor's driveway was not plowed at the same time as mine. The community did not fall into chaos because people were allowed to make their own choices about snow removal. Life went on, people adapted, and we all learned to mind our own business a little more. Robert Eastman did a good job as HOA president for 2 years before stepping down to spend more time with his grandchildren. The board position was filled by Patricia Davis, who had been the lone dissenting voice during the original snow removal vote. Under her leadership, the HOA became even more hands-off, intervening only when absolutely necessary and always seeking input from homeowners before making major decisions. Tommy's business continued to thrive. He never did another HOA-wide contract, preferring to work with individual clients who actually wanted his services. He told me once that he made more money and had far less stress that way. I could not argue with that logic. As for the money Tommy made from the HOA before the contract was terminated, he invested it wisely. He bought a newer truck with a better plow system, upgraded his equipment, and even took his family on a nice vacation to Florida in January. He joked that Brenda Morrison had inadvertently funded his trip to Disney World. Susan Chen completed her probation and community service without incident. I saw her once at a local grocery store about a year after the trial. We made brief eye contact, and she quickly turned and walked the other way. I let her go. There was no point in prolonging the animosity. She had paid her debt for the property damage, and as far as I was concerned, that chapter was closed. The neighborhood eventually developed a sense of humor about the whole situation. At the annual summer block party, someone made a joke about the Great Snow Removal War, and everyone laughed. It had become part of the neighborhood's lore, a story people told when explaining why our HOA had such limited powers compared to other subdivisions. I think about that winter sometimes when I am sitting in my living room, watching snow fall outside my window. I think about how close we came to an even worse situation, and how lucky we were that enough people in the neighborhood stood up and said that the HOA had gone too far. Democracy worked in our little subdivision, even if it took a while and made a mess along the way. The revised bylaws that came out of that conflict have served the neighborhood well. In the 5 years since the snow removal fiasco, the HOA has stayed focused on its core mission. They maintain the entrance landscaping, organize the annual block party, send out reminders about city ordinances, and generally keep things running smoothly without micromanaging anyone's personal property decisions. There have been a few small controversies since then, nothing compared to the snow removal situation, but it is inevitable in any community. Someone wanted to paint their house an unusual color. Someone else built a fence that might have been 6 inches too tall according to the covenants. In each case, the board handled it with common sense and flexibility, working with the homeowners to find reasonable solutions rather than immediately wielding their authority like a hammer. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had just said no that morning when Brenda knocked on my door, if I had refused to give her Tommy's information and let her figure out her own snow removal solution. Would things have been better? Would we have avoided all the drama? But then, I realized that someone like Brenda would have found another issue to obsess over. The snow removal situation was just the catalyst. The real problem was an HOA structure that gave too much power to too few people without adequate checks and balances. If it had not been the snow plowing, it would have been something else, and in a weird way, the whole mess led to positive changes. The neighborhood is better governed now than it was before. Homeowners are more engaged and aware of what the HOA can and cannot do. People actually read the bylaws now and pay attention to board elections. That never would have happened without a crisis to wake everyone up. As I sit here writing this on a cold December evening, watching the first significant snowfall of a new winter, I hear the familiar sound of Tommy's truck coming down the street. He pulls into my driveway right on schedule, plows efficiently, and is gone within 15 minutes. I transfer $80 to his account through my phone, the same simple arrangement we have had for years now. My driveway is clear. My neighbor's driveway still has 8 inches of snow on it because they prefer to wait until morning to shovel. 2 houses down, a different plow service is clearing that driveway because they use a different company. Every driveway on the street looks different, and it is absolutely fine. There is no uniformity, no enforced community standard, no mandatory service. Just people making their own choices about their own property, living their own lives in their own ways. And somehow, despite what Brenda Morrison believed, the neighborhood has not descended into chaos. Property values have actually increased. People are happy. Life goes on. I learned a lot from that winter. I learned about the dangers of malicious compliance, about the importance of reasonable governance, about the way small conflicts can spiral out of control when egos and authority get involved. But mostly, I learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for your community is to stand up and say no when someone tries to exert control where it does not belong. Tommy texts me a quick message. All done. Stay warm. I send back a thumbs-up emoji and return to watching the snow fall. Tomorrow morning, I will drive out of my clear driveway to go to work, and I will not give it a second thought. That is exactly how it should be.